Under the weeping sky, the rain began as a trembling whisper and turned the city into a thing that wept. It fell in thin silver threads and blunt sheets, drumming on tin roofs, sluicing down gutters, pooling in the hollows of cobblestone streets as if the ground itself conspired to keep every sorrow. Lantern light blurred into halos, and the smell of wet stone and smoke braided with the faint, metallic tang of the river that ran like a wound through Gyron's lower quarter. Here, the facades leaned close as if for gossip. Shutters sagged. The paint flaked into confetti for the gutters. The city held its breath beneath the rain and kept its secret faces turned inward. Corinne moved through that damp anatomy like a small, determined current. She walked with Eli strapped to her back in a blanket that had once been red and was now a weathered map of stains and stitches. The child's cheek rested against her shoulder, loose breath puffing warm and fragile into the night. Her shawl, threadbare at the edges, did nothing to stop the cold working under her ribs. The cold was not simply temperature. It was rent notices folded into envelopes, the hum of the noodle shop's brass bell when a patron refused to pay, the way neighbors turned their faces when men with ledgers and watchful collars came by. It was the slow, precise arithmetic of hunger. Her footsteps were careful, 1, 2, 1, so as not to shift Eli from sleep. When he did stir, his small hand, cold and trusting, would find the nape of her neck. He smelled of milk and damp wool and something else, an animal innocence she had not the words to name. Corinne hummed a lullaby without remembering where she'd learned it, a half-formed ribbon of sound that held both prayer and threat. Survive. She had learned the city's narrow rules. Keep your eyes lowered, your hands clean of other people's misfortunes. Be quick, be quiet, be grateful for small mercies. She had also learned how to make herself smaller in the world, to fold her heart into a pocket so it would not snag on the coarse edges of other people's lives. Tonight, however, something in the puddles betrayed her. As she crossed an intersection, a smear of lamplight lay like a coin on the water's surface, and, for a breath, her reflection did not obey. It was subtle. At first, only a looseness, as if her face were not quite attached to the water. Then, for a second, the reflection's eyes caught a light not present in the lane. A twin spark like a star trapped under ice. Her lips in the puddle moved when she did not, fracturing the lullaby into a chord that was wrong. Corinne halted, chest tightening. Eli stirred and sniffled, a small sound that pulled her back to the present. She told herself it was the rain, the way the light tricked the eye, the fevers of a tired mind. The human mind can conjure anything when hungry and lonely. She had seen it. She told herself this and kept moving. Yet the sensation remained, an impression of something old beneath the skin, like the aftertaste of an ancestral wine. The city's old bones had a memory. She felt it in the way the alleys seemed to lean together to hear. It was a small, private tremor, one that would not have been worth following, except the footsteps came afterward. They were not the hurried, clumsy steps of those who performed labor until their bodies forgot ease. They were measured, unhurried, as though each footfall was an annotation in a long, patient book. From the doorway of a house that had once been grand, its stone now fretted by lichens and time, came a figure. For a moment he was only a silhouette in the rain, a long coat that drank water like a raven, shoulders that did not arc under cold, a tallness that made the doorway seem smaller by comparison. When the lamplight found him, it fell into different shapes. He was handsome in a way that did not invite warmth. He had the sort of face artists sketch when they are trying to remember a something that existed before grief. Bone and shadow arranged with a cruel gentleness, cheekbones like chisels, a mouth that could be kind or ruinous, eyes black as polished stone and inexplicably deep. His hair answered the night, dark, obedient, swept back. He stood with hands folded, pale as the underside of a leaf, and the rain seemed to bend around him rather than fall upon him. "Child," he said. The voice was not street-sorted, but old, an accent with the edges hammered smooth by years in passageways without daylight. It was the kind of sound you could imagine beneath cathedral vaults or in the hush after a battle. "You carry cold." Corinne's fingers tightened on Eli's blanket. She could have retreated into practiced suspicion. She could have stepped aside and asked no questions. That was the life she'd learned, to mistrust gifts, especially in a city where kindness often had a ledger. But Eli's teeth had been chattering on the last wind. His small form had sunk heavy with fever the week before, and the word cold carved its own urgency. She kept her voice flat and small. "I have shelter. Thank you." The stranger's head tilted the barest degree, not in curiosity, but in a courtesy as old as monarchs. "Shelter calls you by another name." He smiled, an expression that was not for warmth so much as calculation. "Corinne." The name fell from his lips with the same intimate certainty as if he had been the one to utter it every night of her life. Corinne's chest constricted, not with fear at being known, but because she had not told him. She had told strangers the wrong names, told lies that fit like new shoes, but she had never heard her own name spoken back to her like an address. "How do you?" she began, and closed her mouth. The question felt foolish. The city had ears and tongues. It had more secrets than the stars. But there was something else in the way he looked at Eli, a soft, unreadable tilt that did not belong to strangers. "You carry old blood, child." He stepped closer, and the rain that touched him did not stick. It slid away as if the man himself were a thing designed to repel weather. "It has left traces. Even the puddles remember." He reached out, not to touch, but to indicate the line of rooftops that separated the lower quarter from the hill where Castle Marrow brooded. "There is shelter where stone remembers names. Come." Every instinct in Corinne told her to shake her head. Her life had been a ledger of small choices and smaller luck. She had learned to be cautious of doors that opened in the night for reasons she could not pay. To walk with a stranger, tall, impossibly calm, who knew her name and spoke of things unseen, was an invitation to ruin. But in the rain, the city had only two offers: keep walking and give Eli another night of cold and hunger, or accept help and risk all the unknown debts that kindness can carry. The lamplight carved the stranger's features into a memory she could not refuse. There was something human in the way the corners of his mouth softened as he watched Eli, something that tied the cruel angles of his face to a place of feeling. The moment stretched. Corinne thought of the ledger of the noodle shop, of faces that would not wait, of the little pact she had made beneath her breath every morning. Keep him fed, keep him alive. "Why?" she asked at last, the syllable used against the rain and the man's stillness. "Why help us?" He considered her question as one considers a map. "Because you are not like the rest of the city." His eyes, which had been gravel, became glass for a heartbeat. "And because the world keeps people who both frighten and save it." She wanted, so badly, to refuse the poetry. "And what will you charge?" He smiled again, and it was small and terrible. "Only what you already carry." He stepped aside, and the doorway beyond him yawned open like an eye. From within came a scent she could not name, old roses that had learned how to survive brimstone, a warmth like libraries in winter. A stair dipped into shadow, a slow, curling descent. "Castle Marrow has rooms and tapestries and food that does not taste of guilt," he said, casually. "There is a nurse who understands small lungs." Corinne's mind performed a catalogue as quick as a ledger. One night's shelter, perhaps more. The danger of owing. What would it mean to a woman with no kin to be indebted to a man who introduced himself in the rain? She imagined chains of power, of barter, of threats whispered over cups of warming broth. But she also imagined Eli's hand uncurling in sleep, not from chills but from warmth. She imagined the ache in her sternum easing, if only a little. She thought of the puddle reflection flicker and the faint star whisper beneath her veins. "Come with me," he said again, simply. There was no command. There was only the patience of one who had waited long enough to know when a soul would finally step. Corinne let out a breath she had been holding so long it hurt. She stepped past the threshold and into the hallway, and the world of the lower quarter shrank behind her like a candle being snuffed. The castle swallowed the rain with breath that tasted of dust and centuries. Torches, blue-flickered, unnatural, lined the walls, and their light drew ribbons across tapestries embroidered with scenes that seemed to move if one stared too long. Portraits hung in carved frames, faces with eyes that followed, mouths arranged as if mid-sentence. Even the air tasted like an archive of grief and grandeur, a place where time had not so much stopped as learned to keep its secrets. Eli shivered once, and Varek, because now Corinne knew his name, spoken like a roll of distant thunder, moved as if compelled by the same small tenderness that had been at the soft edges of his face. He took the child from her with gentleness that surprised her. He cradled him against a chest that was cool and steady. "He will sleep," Varek murmured, then looked up at her. Up close, his onyx eyes were not empty wells, but mirrored things that reflected and did not reveal. "How long?" she asked, the question that sat like a stone in her throat. How long could one accept sanctuary from a man whose presence suggested a history of power and hunger? He tilted his head. There was no mockery in the motion, only a kind of patient gravity. "As long as you need or as long as you belong," he said. "Names have weight in this house. You entered with one." Corinne swallowed, the taste of iron sharp and oddly ancient in her mouth. The castle seemed to listen. A draft curled along the hallway and the tapestries breathed. Somewhere, deep within the stone, something turned, a clockwork of old loyalties and buried oaths. She wanted to step back, to reclaim the safety of anonymity. She wanted to fold herself into the crowd of those whose fortunes never bent the arc of kings and never roused the curiosity of shadows. But Eli was warm and his breath was even. The rain outside beat a steady tattoo against the outer doors. The stranger who had called himself Varek held her son like a promise and spoke her name as if it were a key. Corinne walked forward. The gate behind them closed with a sound that was both iron and pulse, a hinge that sealed more than stone, an ending and a beginning knotted into one. The heartbeat of Castle Marrow swallowed the echo, and in that sudden silence Corinne felt something old and patient exhale. Castle Marrow was not a building so much as a memory set in stone. It crouched on the hill above Gyern like a thinking thing, all angles and patient curves, spires clawing into the low clouds. From the lower quarter, the fortress had seemed remote and forbidding. Up close, it unfolded into corridors that inhaled and exhaled with the rhythm of centuries. Torches burned along the great hall, not with ordinary flame, but with a thin, blue fire that did not smoke. The light it gave off was cold and honest, and when it touched faces, it made the bones speak in histories. The air tasted faintly of lavender and old iron. Tapestries stitched with impossible scenes strode the walls, nights striding through storms, rivers drawn as threads of glass, faces in the weave that shifted if one watched long enough. Corinne moved through it all as if through a waking dream. Her feet made no sound on the flagstones. Eli slept in his blanket, his face full and peaceful in a way it had not been in weeks. Varek's hand rested a fraction away from her back, a distance respectful and oddly protective. It was as if the castle itself watched her, sensing, cataloging, deciding how to place her in its long genealogy. Servants passed in and out of the corridors like smoke. They were pale and practiced, fashioned to wait, to fold cloth and pour wine with hands that moved as if in ritual. When Corinne approached, they vanished from the world as if someone had closed a page in a book. A woman who might have been a housemaid paused at a tapestry and dissolved into shadow before Corinne's eyes. A footman offered no greeting and simply ceased to be. The absence made Corinne's throat thicken. She had expected courtesies and instead found secrets, layers of them. Varek watched her closely. "Do not be startled," he said, his voice a low thread in the hall's tapestry. "They do not mean to frighten. Castle Marrow answers those who belong and hides those who do not. It is an old house with older manners." "How can a place choose?" Corinne asked. The question was small and practical, child of the street talking to a lord of night. But there was no cruelty in it. She had learned to locate what was real. Hunger, rent, the weight of a child's body pressed to your spine. The rest, romance, prophecy, kings, were ornaments she could not afford. Yet even she felt the tiles hum beneath her fingers as if the stones had lungs. "The stones remember what walked on them before," Varek said. "They have a list, a ledger in the dark. Touch them." He inclined his head toward a heavy oak door studded with ironwork. Its surface was beaten and scarred like the palm of a hand. Corinne, with fingers that had mended many hems and counted many coins, placed her palm on the wood. The grain warmed beneath her touch and then shifted, as if a door breathed to give. The iron studs shone with a light she had not seen since childhood in churches she had passed by on market days. With a sound like a long, relieved sigh, the door opened inward. The servants who had vanished reappeared then, faces blurred, garments aligning as if pieces falling into place. They moved about their tasks with eyes that watched and then looked away, a ritual courtesy. Corinne felt watched and accepted at once. It was dizzying. She was a woman who had been taught to make herself as small as a coin. Now rooms opened for her at the merest touch. They walked through the corridor into a chamber that served as a parlor and a library both. Books lined shelves from floor to ceiling. Some were bound in leather, others in skins Corinne could not name. They smelled of dust and ink and a sweetness like dried figs. A hearth, unlit, waited as if for a conversation. Portraits of those who had ruled Marrow stared from their frames, faces that seemed to hold grudges and compliments alike. One particularly grand painting caught Corinne's attention. A woman with the same bone structure as Corinne, though the brush had aged her into heroism. The woman's hair was dark and piled, like a crown. Her eyes were painted with such fervor that they seemed to glint when the blue torchlight shifted. Varek watched Corinne watching. "The house likes you," he observed. "Or perhaps it remembers you." "Remembers what?" she asked, though her instinct answered. Names, blood, patterns remembered like undercurrents. He shrugged, a motion that was both casual and heavy. "In Marrow, nothing is straightforward. It is a house built on promises and penalties. The people you saw vanish are not gone so much as reassigned. They are," he considered, then used a word she recognized from old tailies. "The attendant dead, those whose lives were folded into the castle's hand." Corinne felt a chill that was not the rain reach into her ribs. "So ghosts, not as you think." His voice smoothed into a lecturing softness. "They keep the rooms tidy, do the trivial duties. They are shadows given form by oath." He paused. "Castle Marrow is bound. It keeps itself in exchange for hospitality. That is the nature of the curse. It gives and it takes. No mortal enters untouched. Those who come here leave changed, by time, by blood, by memory." Corinne swallowed. The word curse fell into her like cold water. She had been a poor woman all of her life. Curses were the next ledger, signatures she could not sign away. "Changed how?" "In ways obvious and subtle," Varek said. "Some leave with glimpses of themselves that surprise them. Others forget their names. Sometimes the change is as light as a new scar. Sometimes it is a new hunger." He did not say that sometimes the change was as heavy as becoming someone else entirely. He did not say that the house demanded repayment in forms a mortal could scarcely imagine. Corinne's fingers tightened on Eli's blanket. The child stirred, and for a heartbeat his eyelids fluttered. Varek set him gently on a divan and produced a cup of broth with a servant's quickness. Corinne felt gratitude like a small, sharp tooth. She wanted to ask everything. Why him? Why her? What did it mean that marble remembered names? But questions were a luxuries of safety, and she was not safe here. Yet as she watched the way the castle responded, as the books inhaled her presence and the portrait's eyes lingered, she felt another tug inside her chest. Recognition. It was a sensation like a thread pulling through fabric. It did not need explanation to be felt. "Eat," Varek said. "There will be a nurse who examines him. Rest. You have been," he searched for the right word and found none, "traveling." Corinne let the heat of the broth find her lips. It ran like a blessing down her throat, and the bones in her body unwound a little. For the first time in days, she did not calculate steps. She simply swallowed and watched the castle listen. The nurse moved with the practiced hush of someone who had mended more than cloth. She smelled of powdered herbs and jarred remedies. Her hands were steady as a compass. Corinne watched her examine Eli with an almost frantic gratitude, as if salvation might be measured in breath counts. The nurse's face, when she studied the child, was a mask, readable only by the tilt of her mouth. She listened at his chest with an instrument that was older than common knowledge, and then she cleared her throat. "He is fevered," she said. "Not from ordinary illness. There is a chill under his skin like shadow. Have you been in places where the night sings?" Her eyes flicked to Varek, then away. Corinne's voice thinned. "Markets, alleys, nowhere more than the rain." She might have lied. She might have told of a hell older than the lower quarter. She did not know. The nurse's expression tightened, a worry that did not raid the well of theatrics. Varek's fingers found Eli's small wrist, and the child's pulse steadied beneath them as if soothed by the touch. The nurse's eyes narrowed. "There is something in him that is not simply mortal," she said, the words a warning more than a diagnosis. "If it is to be saved, it will need blood that remembers the dark." Corinne reacted before thought. "You mean you will?" Her voice broke, the syllables were brittle. "You mean you'll give him your blood?" The nurse shook her head. "I will not. I am bound by the castle's terms. To give blood is to give a piece of your life. It is not for those who are pledged to the house. The king," she pronounced the last word with a capital gravity, "may offer. He is not bound in the same way." Verk's face did not change. It was as though habit had carved a cliff in his expression. "Eli is not a tool nor a commodity," he said softly. "He is a life. The choice is mine if I so wish." "No," Corinne said, clinging to some sanity. "You do not." She had heard tales in the lower quarter of monsters who fed on flesh and thought it feeding, but blood-giving was another, older taboo. Vampires, if the stories were true, did not give. They took and grew strong. The idea of a king who would offer his blood felt like myth asking to be believed. Verk's hand tightened minutely. "I will not take. I will offer." He lifted the cup, the same cup that had held broth, and in a movement that seemed oddly ceremonial bore it to his lips. Corinne watched him with the awful fascination of a person watching a sacrament she had not been taught. He tilted his head back. Dark liquid brushed his throat. When he set the cup down, his mouth had contracted into an expression of deliberate temperance. "You will hate me for this," he said, eyes not leaving Eli's face. "You will be afraid because of what it means. But know this, the blood I give does not bind as chains do. It binds as oaths do. If you accept, then an oath is made. The child's life will be steadied, but there will be a tether between him and the one who gave. The bond is both shelter and obligation." Corinne's hands trembled. She had bargained with landlords and loan-takers. She had bartered small favors for food. But to take a pledge of blood from a vampire king was a ledger she had never signed. It felt like surrender and salvation braided together. Eli coughed softly and Verk's jaw worked. "If you refuse, he may die," Verk said plainly. "If you accept, he will not." There was no flourish, only truth, cold as a drawn blade. Corinne pressed her lips together until the taste of metal bloomed. She thought of Eli's small fingers, of how he trusted her without question. She thought of the puddles that had shown her reflection with a star trapped beneath. The memory of her hand on the oak door and the way the wood had yielded was a map in her mind. There were choices that were not choices at all. "Do it," she whispered. The nurse's hands were quick and solemn. Verk extended his wrist, pale, slender, the pulse slow as a bell, and the nurse drew a tiny measure of blood in a vial that hummed like a tuned reed. Then, with a tenderness that seemed almost sacramental, she mixed the vidi with an herbal draught and coaxed Eli to take. The child's face softened. The fever receded as if the sun had been coaxed from behind a cloud. He sighed and then slept, heavy and whole. Corinne's relief was a thunderous thing that knocked breath out of her. She clung to the divan as if to shore herself against the storm. Yet even in her gratitude there was a hollow. Someone had altered the ledger of their lives. Verk had offered a piece of himself that could not be given back without consequence. The binding, once set, stitched them together in ways she could not see. After the nurse left, Verk sat across from Corinne with the look of a judge who had just rendered a verdict that also felt like mercy. "The oath is subtle," he said. "You will feel warmth near the child, odd dreams, and a memory that does not belong entirely to you. You might taste metal when you speak truth. These are not curses in themselves, merely marks left by what we exchanged." Corinne wanted to ask whether Verk had looked into Eli's soul and chosen to give. She wanted to know if he had weighed the price and found her worth it. But the questions gathered like rain and fell unanswered. She simply reached out and laid her hand over Eli's small fist, and for the first time since the rain had begun, she felt an ember of rest. Word in Castle Marrow moved with the sluggish certainty of ink drying. The nurse's steps had no breathless rush. The servants adjusted as if the world had merely turned a page. Yet the exchange of blood left ripples on the lips of those who witnessed it, in the corners of the portraits that seemed to straighten. The tapestry of the castle had a way of shifting when a new thread was woven. It noticed fine things. It was Lucen who found Corinne a day later. He appeared in the library as if summoned by the very books. Where Varek was a mountain, still, severe, inevitable, Lucen was smaller, like a bell that had forgotten how to be loud. He wore spectacles whose lenses caught the blue torchlight and multiplied it. His hair was not as dark as Varek's. It had the dusky gray of stormwater. He smelled of vellum and ink and something tart. "You are Corinne," Lucen said, stepping closer with a curiosity that bordered on scholarly hunger. "Forgive me. I am Lucen, keeper of records, translator of dead tongues. We have been waiting." Corinne regarded him with the caution of one on constant watch. "Waiting for what?" "For you," Lucen replied simply. He had an air of someone who had spent too much of his life at the lip of things, where history meets rumor. "There is an old ledger in our archive. It is not merely names and debts. It is a mapping of possibilities. It mentions a woman born under a weeping moon, whose blood can," he hesitated, searching for a word that did not belong to the barrow of simple speech, "cleanse or end the old rot." Corinne felt the floor tilt. The phrase echoed the nursery lullaby feeling that had been present since the puddle reflection. A dark chorus she could not understand fully, but that felt familiar. She had never known her ancestry beyond a mother who died before she could weave more than stories. The idea that there might be an inheritance, however terrible, felt like a double-edged ring. "The prophecy?" she asked, and the syllables were small. Lucen nodded. "Our histories are tangled with prophecy. Some are polite superstitions. Others are cruel certainties. This one is older than the lineage of Marrow. It speaks of a woman who will be born when the moon itself appears to weep, when its light slips into the tears of sky. Her blood, it says, will either seal the curse or unmake it. There is a line in the ledger. She will come carried by rain." Corinne's chest tightened. She thought of the night she had arrived in the city again, the rain, and her reflection's star-buried eyes. She was a woman who had never expected to be named in a book. Lucen pulled out a folio, his fingers tracing the brittle parchment as a reader might trace a loved one's face. He read aloud in a voice that made the room feel like an amphitheater. "The blood that remembers dark can either cleanse or bind. The woman who bears it will decide. A king cursed by centuries will wake or sleep depending upon the mixing of their lines. Balance by kinship or loss by greed." The words landed on Corinne like a stone into deep water. She had always thought her life a simple spool: work, feed Eli, sleep when she could. Now there were gnarled roots beneath the visible ground. Prophecy made things larger and simultaneously shrank her into a single role. She had no desire for destinies. She had desires of plain things, shelter that did not smell of desperation, and a child who might grow into summers. "Why me?" she whispered. "I am not." She could not even finish. She did not belong to noble tailies. She was mud-smeared and practical. Lucen's spectacles fogged a little as he moved them down his nose. "The ledger does not often give reasons. It notes facts and leaves the rest to hands and hearts. But there are marginalia, small notes written as the world changed. Look here." He tapped a notation between two lines, an ink blot that had bled into the script like a stain. "This line was written by one who lived when the king still loved. It says, 'She is like the one he lost.'" Varek, who had been in the doorway like a statue with a thought, inhaled. He did not enter the room fully. He watched as if privacy mattered less than the rhythm of revelation. For the first time since Corinne's arrival, there was a shifting in his face that was not merely stoic control. Something like memory, soft and terrible, flickered. "I have nightmares," he said quietly, as if sharing a confession he had not meant to voice aloud. "I have had them for centuries. A woman with hair like ravens and skin like low moonlight. We were young fools, perhaps. I thought I could stop what came. I did not. The world changed me. The ledger remembers her as well." Corinne's legs felt hollow under her. The idea that she might be tied to someone who had been loved once, so needless and human, was almost unbearable. To be both a servant of the prophecy and a woman who simply wanted to keep her child alive felt like wearing incompatible garments at once. She wanted to dissolve into practicalities, to ask instead about rent and food, and where she might go if the prophecy proved false. But the ledger's script had a gravity. Prophecies were not polite mistakes. They were instructions at which the world paused. Lucen's voice softened. "If you are indeed the one mentioned, Then there are choices. You can accept what you are and attempt to turn it toward good, or you can flee. There are margins in the book for either. But no, the moment of decision is near. The castle remembers not only names but possibilities. It will press for one which satisfies the old balances. Varek stepped closer then, his presence like a shade at the edge of a candle. "I will not force your fate," he said. "Yet I fear what will happen if those who seek to harness blood find you first. Not all of us are kind in the way I have been." Corinne's laugh was a small, unamused thing. "You say kind like it's simple," she said. "You offered your blood to my son. That is not a charity given without cost." "It is not given without cost," Varek agreed. "But sometimes cost is the only currency left to purchase life." She did not know whether to be grateful or furious. Both feelings flickered in her like candlesticks. She was a woman without choice in so many things. Now the ledger set her on a stage she had never auditioned for. Lucen watched her, eyes twinkling with the curiosity of one who deals in half-explanations. There was sympathy under the scholar's detachment, but it was the sympathy of someone who had learned to set down heavy things and move on. "Learn," Lucen said finally, as if pronouncing a sentence that might be mercy. "Learn what you can. The book helps those who help themselves." And so, Corinne found herself enrolled in a curriculum she had not requested. Lessons about blood that was older than the city, about the castle's strange ecology, about the weight of names and the ledger's relentless appetite. She learned that knowledge could be armor much as iron could be, or it could be another thing that weighed the shoulders down. Training with Varek was not like training in a market brawl or the practical lessons she had learned washing dishes for taverns. It was measured and deliberate, part philosophy, part torture. He taught her to feel the cadence of a heartbeat in ways she had never before tried to notice, that of Eli, but also the little haggard beats of servants in another room, the slow, ancient pulse of the castle itself. He taught her to listen to the flavor of air. Some nights the corridors smelled of copper and promise, other nights of ash and regret. He set tasks: touch this tapestry and tell me what memory it keeps. Stand in that archway and tell me whether the stone prefers moonlight to torchlight. The exercises made no sense initially, but slowly they stitched together a map. She discovered that when she touched certain things, iron, bone, dried herbs, there was a flicker of light in her veins. It was not visible from the outside, but inside it felt like a thread of starlight running through milk. Varek called it by an old name, one that tasted of Latin and salt, vestigum sanguis. "It is blood remembering itself," he said once, watching her as if a gardener watches the first shot of green in spring. "Your lineage holds a thread of something older than our politics. It is not merely magic, it is a memory channel. You can coax it to purge corruption or to temper rage." She learned to focus that memory into small acts. She put her hand on a rotted tapestry and felt the decay shudder, then ease as if soothed. She laid her palm on a glass decanter clouded with age and watched the blur lift. It made her feel powerful and sick with responsibility all at once. Power, she had thought once, was for those with coin and pedigree. Now it sat in her like a secret and beckoned. Varek's teaching was not clinical. There were moments of proximity that made the air between them thick as warm honey. He would correct a posture, and their fingers would touch. The contact was small, but it hummed in a way that set Corinne's breath off schedule. He watched her with an intensity that sometimes felt like courtship and sometimes like study. When she stumbled in the child's lullaby, he sang the missing note for her, a bar of sound that made her stomach flip. He did not speak of love in the common fashion. His words for it were other, phrases about returning colors and reclaiming breath. But the way he looked at her made patience feel like a confession. Their lessons were interrupted one night by the sound of shattering glass and a chorus of harsh voices. Rebel vampires, those who resented Varek's restraint and thirsted for the old freedoms, had found a way into one of the outer wards. The alarms were not bells but the castle's own complaint, a low, harmonic thrumming that shivered along the floor. Torches flared blue and then white as the household roused. Varek did not hesitate. He moved like a current that had known its channel for centuries. Corinne followed not out of bravery, but because Eli slept, and he was the center of everything that mattered to her. The corridor emptied around them, and for a sliver of a moment, Corinne understood why people told stories of kings being both shelter and storm. The rebel vampires came like shadows given teeth. Their leader was a woman with a grin like split wood and eyes that glittered with a cruel kind of hunger. She moved with a predatory arrogance, flanked by those who had nothing to lose and all the night to take. They attacked not indiscriminately, but with a precision that suggested they had particular sins in mind, rooms to burn, relics to desecrate, a ledger to steal. Varek's fury was a thing Corinne had never seen, less a loss of temper than the opening of a sealed vault. His voice rolled out like an edict. The rebels recoiled for a heartbeat, as if sound itself had weight. Then the hall filled with a violence that was not only physical. There was a clashing of wills, hunger and order, old rights and hard-won restraint. Corinne, in the press of it, felt her vestigium sing with white-hot anguish. One of the rebels, a slender man with a scarred lip, lunged and their fingers tangled. His skin was the cold of river stones. Corinne felt the phantom of Eli's breath at her back, and the animal clarity of fear sharpened her focus. She laid her palm on the rebel's chest and thought of warmth and belonging in a single, desperate image. The man's expression changed, anger unfurling into a stunned slackness, and he crumpled as if someone had pulled out the support of a puppet. Varek turned then, and Corinne saw not only mastery, but something like pride in the way he watched. He fought with a cruelty tempered by mercy, and in the space between his strikes there was a tenderness that was both terrifying and tender. After the skirmish, when the rebels were bound and the castle's attendants had corralled them into the darkness where they would be judged, Varek approached Corinne with a look that was equal parts appraisal and gratitude. "You did not have to do that," he said quietly. "You could have stayed behind." "I couldn't let them take him," she said. Her voice was raw. She felt the aftershock like a bruise. He reached out and touched her forehead as one touches a fevered brow. The contact was brief, but it carried an intimacy that stunned her. "You make me remember what it felt like to breathe," he murmured. The words settled between them like a confessional. Corinne felt a hot shame and an odd, dangerous warmth. To be the one who made a king remember breath was a responsibility beyond any ledger she had known. It was also, in the most private place of desire, a lure. That night, when the castle settled back into its habitual rhythm, Corinne lay awake and felt the ache of the new power in her limbs. She had tasted command in the act of pushing back a rebel, and it felt both righteous and terrifying. Varek's breath, when she had passed him in the corridor, was a slow tide. The world had given her a role she had not requested. Still, she could not pretend at ignorance. The ledger of lore demanded a decision. She had made one small choice, Eli's life, and now the cascade of consequences ran further than her night could keep. It was in the smaller hours, when the castle's blue light thinned to a susurration, and the portraits were sleepily accusatory, that Corinne found the one painting that made the tapestry shift under her feet. She had wandered the gallery as if in search of answers. The castle, it seemed, had a way of leading those who asked. The painting was at the end of an alcove that smelled of beeswax and old ink. It was larger than life and framed in carved oak that had the faintest suggestion of claws. The woman in the portrait wore a dress of sable velvet and a necklace with a single onyx bead. Her face, rendered with a master's hand, was Corinne's face. The same slope of cheek, the same small scar near the jaw, the same stubbornly brave chin. The painted woman's eyes were not simply likenesses. They were accusatory, fond, and mourning all at once. Around her, small figures moved in the brushwork, children, courtiers, candles guttering. The caption beneath the frame read in spidery script, "Isolde, Queen of the First Year of Night." Corinne's fingers went cold against the gilt. The room tilted again. The ledger in the library felt less like rumor and more like a mirror that had been held up wrong. She remembered Lucen's marginalia. "She is like the one he lost." Had the king loved a woman with her face? Had that woman been lost to him and left him a ledger of grief? She had no memory of such a life. She had only the memory of a mother who hummed half songs and a childhood of scraping by. Yet the painted woman's mouth trembled with a weight Corinne knew without having lived it, the weight of being both revered and used. The castle reacted. A breeze curled along the gallery that smelled faintly of lilacs and something older. Torches flicked as if in recognition. The tapestry near the painting rippled though there was no wind. For a moment, Corinne felt that the house itself inhaled, a long, sentient draw, and that it approved or disapproved with equal vigor. She turned to find Varek standing in the doorway, hands folded in the same studied manner he wore when he judged the world. He did not come closer at once. Instead, he let silence be the bridge instead of speech. "You see her," he said finally. Corinne's voice was small. "She looks like me." Varek's expression slit into 100 parts. There was grief there, yes, but also a tenderness that made the gallery feel crowded. "She was my queen once," he said. "Not queen by title, queen by foolish heart. Isolde was her name. She wore sun in her laugh and foolishness in her fingers. I thought we could bend fate to will. We were arrogant in those days. The world showed us the price." "Isolde died?" The question had the brittle edge of a stone hitting glass. "In the end, yes," Varek said. There was a scar in his voice. "She gave what men and gods asked of her, and I failed to protect what I loved. The ledger remembers her as one who resisted the dark, and she paid." His eyes were not accusatory now, but open and wet. "I have carried that failure as a weight for centuries. I thought I had buried her name like a stone. I did not expect the house to keep her brushstrokes." Corinne felt absurd guilt rising in her chest. She had not lived Isolde's life. She had not been loved by Varek. How could she bear the weight of someone else's sorrow? Yet the painting tugged at something ancient in her, threads of recognition that felt biological and not merely sentimental. Her reflection in the puddles, the ledger's lines, the painting's accusation, these things knitted together into a possibility she could not ignore. "Am I her reborn or your curse reborn?" she asked, the question a blade she had kept hidden. It was the only honest question left. Varek came close then, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the map of long-lived sorrow. "You are both," he said. It was not a comforting answer. It contained both an admission and an invitation. "Life does strange things with cycles. Sometimes it repeats the same shape, sometimes it rearranges it. Whether you are blood from a past or a shape the world chose to echo, the thread is here now. That is truth enough." Corinne felt something fracture and reform inside her. The castle around them hummed in a new key. She had been a woman of small measures, bread, shelter, a child's breath. Now she had become an axis upon which old forces might pivot. It was more than she had wanted. It was more than she had feared. Yet beneath her fear there burned, like a cold star, a small sense of purpose. Perhaps, if the ledger was a map, she might not only be the instrument of fate but also its author. Varek's hand found hers, and with a gentleness that was not theatrical, pressed his thumb into the soft part of her palm. The contact was a tether and a question. "Stay," he whispered. "Learn, choose for yourself. If the world asked for sacrifice, let it be measured. If it asked for love, let us pay that too." Corinne looked down at the painting again, at the face that matched hers and yet belonged to another life. She felt the weight of choice like a coin in her coat. The ledger had offered her roles. She would decide which to accept. For Eli's sake, for the city, and perhaps, for reasons she could not yet name, for the quiet returning of breath to a king's chest, she would stay. The castle listened as she made that choice, and with a sound like settling stone, accepted her answer. The blue torches shivered, the tapestries relaxed, and a page in some unseen ledger turned. The castle had 1,000 ways of breathing, and once it smelled of war, the air itself changed, heavy as wet wool, metallic as an unsheathed blade. Rumors moved through Castle Marrow like rodents beneath floorboards. Whispers wrapped in silk, promises traded for favors, old debts reopened and brandished like knives. Corinne felt it in the way the servants spoke in clipped sentences, and in the way the tapestries seemed to nod at the corners. Even Lucen, behind his spectacles and his polite detachment, carried a nervousness like a scent on his sleeve. "You have enemies," he said to her in the library one dusk, voice wetted with a scholar's fear. He laid a brittle map on the table, inked sigils of houses and lines that marked old rivalries. "Not all think the mixing of blood and the mercy of our king is a mercy. There are those who remember what it was to feed without restraint. There are those who believe a prophecy is a leash, not a salvation." Corinne traced a finger over a line that led from the outer wards to the castle's heart. "Who leads them?" she asked. Lucen pointed with 2 fingers trembling slightly. "Lord Sareth. He was once a commander in Marrow's Night Guard. Proud, hungry, and cruel. He believes that if your blood can unmake the curse, it can be exploited. He will not allow corollaries of mercy to dilute what he sees as rightful power." Word of Sareth's march came like thunder after distant lightning. Out beyond the hill, the night seemed to have gathered its breath. Sareth's banners were not bright. They were stitched from shadow and anger, and among his followers were those who had once been Varek's most trusted lieutenants. Betrayal cut deeper when it came from a hand you had once clasped. One of those hands, smooth and practiced, belonged to Varek's chamberlain, a man who moved the chess pieces of palace politics with a smile that rarely reached his eyes. Thern's betrayal was not immediate. It dissolved like sugar into tea. He had smiled at Corinne when she first arrived, had brought her blankets with an ease that felt rehearsed. He had spoken of loyalty and lineage and looked the other way as Lucen read from parchments. But when Sareth's envoys came under the cover of storm, and the castle sentries reported movement along the outer wall, Thern's absence from his post was not an oversight. He had reasons, and they were reasons dressed as principle. Varek's fury at the betrayal was a private thing. He did not bellow in the halls. Instead, he walked the battlements alone, one hand resting on the stone, the other tapping a rhythm that meant calculation. Corinne watched him from a corridor window as he stared down into the dark fields beyond, into the shapes of men and hunger, and the slow approach of those who would take what they felt ordained to take. "We should leave," Varek said one night, his voice bare. He stood in Corinne's doorway as if he had been rehearsing the words for years. Rain had started again, fine and insistent like a curtain. "Take Eli and run. The city offers alleys and anonymity. You are small enough to be unremarkable. That is safety." Corinne had expected the order, a king's instinct to protect what he valued most by setting it out of harm's way. She had expected to obey. The roads were familiar to her. She knew how to lurk in shadows. But when she looked at Varek, she saw the map of his exhaustion and all the small failures he had carried like lead. She thought of the painting, Isolde's face, and the things she had overheard Lucen read in the ledger. The prophecy did not say she could hide from fate in an alley. It said her blood could unmake or bind. If there was a chance the castle itself might be the hinge on which the world turned, she could not simply be led away like a coin. "No," she said before she had time to measure the defiance. The word rose from an animal place, protective, incandescent. "I will not run. You know what the alleys are for people like me. I will not trade one fear for another. If this is our battle, I will be part of it." Varek's eyes flashed, not with anger but with an old, paternal ache. "You are not a soldier. You have a life to protect Eli." "So do you," she shot back. "I am sick of being told that safety is always flight. If we only ever ran, nothing would change. If you stand and fight, you stand with me, or you let me stand alone." That was not what he wanted. Kingly instincts prickled against the stubborn, human part of him that could love and lose and brood thereafter. He wanted to send them away wrapped in false security. He knew, however, that if Corinne left, Sareth's people would find a way to twist whatever her blood could do into chains for others. He had not imagined mercy would be a weakness. The thing he called kindness had cost him alliances and comfort. Now its cost included the woman who had made him remember breath. "Stay," he said at last, voice knotted with something like fear. "But promise me you will not be reckless." "I promise I will be careful," Corinne answered. It was not the promise he had wanted, but it was the only promise she could give without surrendering her will. When the trumpets announced Sareth's arrival, Castle Marrow itself seemed to brace. The rebel forces clustered in the low fields like a storm front, banners snapping, armor catching moonlight like teeth. Refugees from the lower quarter huddled in doorways watching the hill with the same peculiar mix of fascination and dread that breeds in the human animal when gods and monsters approach. The city's commoners could not know whether they were observing a liberation or a massacre. They would find out with the dawn. Sareth's first strike was not through the main gate, but through cunning. He set diversions at the southern wall, while a cadre scaled the eastern battlements in the wet dark. They were ghosts in leather and malice, and Thern's knowledge shepherded them like a shepherd who knew every hidden stile and latrine. A traitor's map is the most dangerous thing in war. The alarm was a terrible clarion thing, not a single sound but a chorus of stone and chain and the castle's own murmuring. Blue torches leapt white. Men and women, some bound by oath, some by desperation, took up arms. Varek gathered his loyalists like a hand drawing around a hearth. Corinne stood among them, Eli strapped to her back beneath a cloth that smelled of her and him and the life she fought to keep. The child was heavy with sleep and stillness, unaware of the tide that now threatened to redraw the coastline of their lives. When the rebels struck, the corridor became a river of motion. Steel sang, teeth gritted. The scent of iron rose like a chorus. The rebels were not merely hungry for blood, they were hungry for symbolic victory, proof to themselves that the old freedoms of the night could be reclaimed. Their leader, Lord Sareth, was a coiled thing, moving with a commander's grace and a butcher's relish. He sought Varek in particular, not merely to dethrone, but to punish. Corinne felt her vestigium pulse like a second heart. When a rebel lunged at a young attendant with the intent to maim, she put both hands on the man's shoulders and poured into him an image of warmth. A mother's kitchen, sunlight through a window, a child's hand finding a parent. The attacker's face softened. He hesitated. For that moment, the possibility of a different life entered his mind, and he faltered. A soldier behind Corinne took advantage and disarmed him. She had never felt more dangerous or more humane. Varek's wrath in combat was a terrible artistry. He moved as if his every action were both a memory and a law. Where he struck, the night itself seemed to recoil. Men whose teeth glinted like knives found their wills undone under his gaze. He was a king in motion, sometimes brutal, sometimes strangely merciful, but always precise. Then Sareth unleashed a gambit that changed the tenor of the battle. He summoned the wound of the old knights, the darkness that once had been law. From beneath his cloak he unfurled a relic, an obsidian shard rimmed in old runes, one of those artifacts that sorcerers traded in and kings coveted. When it kissed the air, it sang a note that made the castle's bones ache. Shadows stretched and fed on the torchlight like feathers on a gale, and creatures that had been sleeping in the corners pressed forward, their hunger renewed. The shard did something else. It stared at Varek like accusation, pulling threads of his past open. For a moment, only a sliver, Varek's skin tightened and a sound came from him that was not human. He threw himself into the breach like a man who had been living with something wrapped in his chest and now could not hold it in any longer. With emotion both terrible and magnificent, he spread his arms and something unfurled along his back. Wings that drank the torch's light and turned it into shadow, enormous and wrong in scale, the membrane etched with the pattern of the night. Varek became not only man but myth, a hulking shadow with the grace of a winter wind. The sight made rebels falter. Even some of Varek's men took an involuntary step back, fury and fear braided into a single knot. But where the wings cast shade, they also attracted ruin for their owner. Varek's true form had always been a dangerous paradox, magnificent in its capacity for awe, awful in its promise of unbounded hunger. To unfurl such power was also to remind the world of what he had been, an immortal predator. Corinne felt the prophecy's shape tighten. Lucen had said words about mixing lines and choices, about blood that could either seal or unmake. Here, with wings that could blot the moon and rebels whose music hummed like a hive, the ledger's margins bled into reality. The shard in Sareth's hand pulsed, and the castle's blue light answered with a cold clarity. "Bind him," Sareth cried, voice like flint. "Keep him from the well. If the king falls into the old song, the curse will spread again and color the living with our hunger." Corinne felt the pull of panic in Varek's men, a fear that their leader might become the storm that swept them all away. She moved then with an instinct that was neither calculated nor pawn-like. She stepped between Varek and a figure with a blade raised, an assassin with cold eyes, and placed her palm on Varek's chest. The contact was burning and comforting at once. She called to the old memory in her blood, the vestigium. Think of warmth, of breathing, of sun through a cracked window, of the laugh of a child. The memory flared, a living thing between them, and the assassin's blade showed a pause as if seeing a different end to his strike. Verk's wings folded in a move that was both revealing and shielding. He looked at Corinne, and for a second beyond the fury, he saw the woman who had come into the rain with a child strapped to her back. He saw her make choices and keep them. In that glance, they found each other as if two tides had met and found resonance. Lucen, at Verk's side, shouted a revelation that both saved and damned them. The prophecy, listen, their blood, if mixed with intent, can unmake the curse. But it asks a price. The ledger's other note, sacrifice is the lock, one must choose finality. Choose what? Corinne demanded, voice lost among clangs and shouts. Lucen's eyes flashed with terrified knowledge. Either the blood is mixed in life to bind a new covenant that reshapes the nature of the curse, binding the vampires to mortality with mercy, or the mixing must be completed in death, an ending that purges the old pattern altogether. The ledger offers only one finality. One of the bearers must pass. The words were a knife. Corinne's stance wavered like a reed. She thought of Eli's warm hand and of the small song she had hummed into the child's hair. She thought of Verk's tired eyes and the painting of Isolde. The ledger had not offered her a noble death in advance, only a brutal truth. There was a choice, and it would be theirs to make. Sareth's torrent surged forward like a headlong tide. The obsidian shard sang again, and the castle's stone answered with old charms meant to bind and to protect. The final collision was not cinematic in structure but elemental. Oath and hunger, mercy and the lust for power, blood and brick. Corinne felt the vestigium like a thread coiled in her throat, and she wrapped it like rope around her resolve. She moved toward the central hall, where the well of the old rites lay. It was a place of dark and ledgered promises. The shard's call had made it glow like a wound. Verk followed, wings folded now into a mantle, and at his side came those who had not forsaken him. The rebels pressed, and the air smelled of rain and iron and the strange metallic tinge of fate. 10. The choice, tilde 800 1100 words. They reached the heart of the castle as if drawn by the pull of a needle. The well, an old stone basin rimmed with runes that had been half obscured by ivy and years, had been cleared for battle. Sand swept, candles lit, relics placed like witnesses. Sareth stood opposite them, the shard at his throat and the rebels arrayed like wolves. The tension hummed so loud Corinne thought she would hear it in her bones. Lucen caught her elbow. "There is a way to end this without bloodshed," he urged, voice raw. "If we can break the shard and remove the relic's influence." "No," Sareth barked. "You cannot unmake the night without cost." The shard pulsed, and a thin light ran across the surface of the well. It seemed to drink the air and make it thick. In that light Corinne thought she saw, faint and then bright, the ledger's lines writ large. The threads of lives, of choices, of the one who must pass to free the many. Verk looked at Corinne as if for instruction. There were ages in his face and the terrible tenderness of one who loved another enough to let go. "If this is the only path," he said, voice a blade wrapped in velvet, "then choose." Corinne heard Eli's little breath like a bell. She saw, in a flash that was less a vision than an animal memory, the nights she had lain awake counting coins and the small, sunlit laugh of a child in a market. She thought of the painting, Isolde, and of Verk's slow undoing over the centuries. The ledger offered a painful mercy. She could give all and end the hunger that had gnawed at the world for ages, or she could allow a compromise that might leave the line of thirst unbroken in some new, cruel form. Her vestigium surged as she thought. She had learned to coax it to heal, to soothe, to cleanse. She could also imagine, with the clarity of someone who has loved fiercely and pragmatically, the sickening possibility of her blood being used as a key to chains. She saw futures in a flood. Vampires learning to be mortal and cruelly exploiting that mortality, or vampires liberated from hunger, but bound to new, gentler laws. She imagined Eli living into adulthood without fear, and the city finally sleeping through a night without someone's teeth in the dark. "Verk," she said, voice small and steady. "If one must die, I will be the one." His face tore open in grief and disbelief. "No," he said, fury and pleading braided. "I will not allow it. You are my life's proof that mercy can remain." "You cannot." "But I can," she interrupted, and the words were not bravado but a sealed thing. I was ready to die in alleys of cold for as long as I live for my son. If my life ends and the world is free of a curse that hungers at children's throats, then my life, my small life, has meaning. Lucen's hands shook as he read the ledger's final lines aloud. There is precedent, he croaked. A life given to end the hunger, a blood mixed in the chamber of the well, the curse unmade. The ledger calls it mercy, and it has no other name. Varek seized her hands then. His fingers were cold and steady, and then suddenly fine and shaking. He looked not like a king, but like a man who had been retaught sorrow and was now a student. If you do this, I will not be spared the knowledge of your loss, he said. I will remember every laugh and every whisper. Let me hold you as you leave. Corinne's throat closed. She thought of Eli's warm cheek and of the lullaby that had become a promise. Promise me he will be safe, she whispered. Varek's eyes burned with a new flame, fear sharpened into devotion. I promise, he said. I will keep him. I will learn bread and warmth. I will keep your memory alive. They performed the rites in a way that felt less theatrical than sacramental. Lucen chanted lines from the ledger, a language that made the candles tremble. Corinne seated herself on the rim of the well, the stone cold and ancient under her fingers. Eli slept in the hands of a servant, his form small and unknowing. Varek knelt opposite her, his face close and betrayed with grief. Corinne drew a breath as if unhooking a chain. She extended her palm and let Varek take it. He kissed the back of her hand like a vow. Then, with the solemnity of a lover and the finality of a judge, she pricked her palm and let blood fall into the basin. It smoked. No, rather, it warmed and then sang, threads of light uncoiling and uniting with the well's old water. Varek followed, and together they offered their blood. The mixture did not scream. It sang a note that felt like the lifting of a great weight. As the blood mixed, the shards light shivered and then split like an instrument being tuned. The castle's torches flared. There was a sensation like a vast exhale, the old hunger pulling away, some of it cleaved, some of it made whole in a new shape. Corinne felt warmth flow through her like a tide. The ledger's script hummed in her mind, the marginalia turning into a simple, cruel sentence. One life for many. Her limbs grew heavy as if the world had been rebalanced on her shoulders, and the weight was the price. She saw Varek's face tilt in anguish and wonder, those impossible compacts of his eyes that had taught her to love and to fear. She saw him. No, he spoke, breath ragged, hands reaching. You gave me back my soul, he said, words failing then finding, raw with memory and awe. Let me spend it remembering you. Corinne's vision folded into a tunnel of light and then a field of rain. She smiled, a thing that felt like a debt paid and a gift received. She felt the warmth of Eli's life like a bell inside her chest, and then she felt at ease as if he had been set to a different rhythm. She let go of Varek's hands, and the world spun with the sound of pages turning and wind pulling at old curtains. Her last thought was not of prophecy, but of a lullaby and a child's laugh, and then the light took her. When it was done, silence fell with a weight like an answered prayer. The shard cracked and became dull stone. The rebels, who had not known what to do with the mercy they had desired, staggered as their hunger receded from a kind of compulsion to something human and awkward and bewildered. Some wept. Some fell to their knees in confusion. Sareth's eyes burned with a new kind of terror, the terror of men who had hunted ghosts and found them gone. Vern, who had schemed and betrayed, sank to the floor as if someone had unfastened his purpose. Lucen, pale and trembling, closed his ledger as if a page had finally found its rest. Varek cradled Corinne's head in his hands. The wings that had once unfurled now settled into his back like a memory easing its grip. Where once an immortal breath had exhaled, now a mortal gust fogged his hair. He had not become young. He had become fragile and, in that fragility, achingly human. He looked down at her face and let tears, long held and bitter, slide free. He pressed his lips to her forehead and whispered the truth that would be his lasting vow. You gave me back my soul. Let me spend it remembering you. Corinne's last smile lingered like a candle's shadow. The castle listened as if learning a new hymn. Outside, rain began again, gentler now, as if it had been forgiven its earlier grief. In the days that followed, Castle Marrow changed in little ways. Torches burned with less hunger, Servants moved with a softness that was new, and a child named Eli grew into a life not shaded by the terror of old nights. And Varek, once a king of darkness, kept his promise. He learned to make bread and mend blankets, to carry water and keep a lullaby in his chest. He remembered. He remembered every laugh, every small hand, and every ordinary morning that had once been beyond his reach. He remembered Corinne until the last of his days, guarding her story as if it were the castle's most precious relic. Because to him it was, the life that had made him human again.